Sta registrando. Rompi condivisione. La registrazione è in corso. Perfetto. Perfetto, allora.
So thank you very much. I am very happy to be here. I think that my first task is to thank the organizers, of course, Alessandro Piccolo and the other that supported him in organizing this series of seminars. I think that it's a very nice and interesting activity to try to talk between different cultures, because we have different cultures. We did different studies and we are used to different languages. So I think that it is very, very important to try to see whether there is a possibility of dialogue, because we sometimes deal with the same problems, or at least in your study of ancient societies and economies, you deal with a number of social and economic problems that in a way are maybe very important also in the analysis of our current society. And at the same time, what we try to analyze with our tools, and especially our tools, sometimes maybe, but I'm not sure about that, useful and interesting for you too. So I have the task of talking about microeconomics, but I don't know if, no, first of all, I have to thank other people. I have to thank Sergio Cesaratto, who involved me in this adventure, even though I'm not an expert of any kind of literature which is involved with the study of ancient economies or of non-capitalistic economies and economic history in general. And also I have to thank Lorenzo, because he was Verderame, because he was very, very friendly and also very, very interested in dialogue. So we decided together that we start with a briefer presentation. I try to keep my presentation in 30 or maximum 40 minutes, and then I leave the floor to Lorenzo, and so that we have a second round in order to engage with each other, with the themes that we try to address. And this is, again, an attempt at a dialogue. So thank you also, Lorenzo. So my task is to talk about microeconomics, but I must say that before defining microeconomics, I need to give some premise. So this is the structure of my presentation. Especially in the first part, I will try to develop what you find in this slide, which is the existence of different theoretical approaches to economic analysis, which can be a very trivial thing, but it's not, because it's rarely recognized both within economics and outside economics, that in reality we have different ways to look at economic problems that sometimes imply a completely different approach to some questions. Even the words that we use are not the same. For example, the discipline that we practice, we critical economists prefer to call it political economy, and the others, or at least the dominant approach in economic theory, calls it economics. So there is a big difference, because there is something implicit in this. at a certain point in the history of economic thought, the discipline itself changed its theoretical status. And this is exemplified by the fact that we changed the name, that they changed the name of the discipline. So it's not irrelevant. And also it explains why sometimes the very object of the discipline changes between the two different approaches. I say that there are two approaches because there are these big two approaches which may mark a very different way of looking at the economic phenomena. I call them classical political economy because it derives from the work of classical economists, and the marginalism of neoclassical theory, which is still nowadays dominant. But of course, there are many other approaches, and especially there are a lot of derivations of these two approaches. For example, you don't see here any reference to Keynes and Keynesianism, but all of you know that Keynes is a very important economist. But I'm talking about a branch of economic theory in which the work of Keynes is, let's say, less relevant. That's why Keynes is not mentioned here. But of course, if you like, if you want, at the end of the conversation, we can also discuss about the role of Keynesian revolution in the kind of history of economic thought that I'm trying to synthesize. So at the end of I would like to compare these two approaches. I just put here the main characteristics of these approaches, but I will not read them now, and I will go on with the slides so that we can directly address them. And only at the end of this, or at a certain point of this comparison, I will try to explain what is microeconomics, because if there is no awareness about the fact that there are these different approaches, it's also difficult to explain why microeconomics may mean different things. Then, of course, I will identify something which is an object of analysis, which is especially the theory of value and distribution that is commonly recognized in both approaches as part of microeconomics, and deal with the differences between the two approaches about this. But the aim of my talk is not only to make a boring lesson about economic theory. I know that it may be less interesting, maybe for people but anyway, I think that it is important, but to address some of the questions that maybe can put us in dialogue with each other. And so I have a slide which talks about themes that I would like to address. Some of them will come out during my first part of the presentation, but then we can also address explicitly some of these other themes in the second round of discussion. And so I will very quickly say what I'm interested in and what I think can be useful for our discussion. One is the question of generic versus specific abstractions. Another one has to do with the method of analysis and the difference between the deductive and the historical method. Then we have the big theme of the relationship between economic theory and institutions, and unfortunately, yesterday, the Nobel Prize was given to three people that I have to talk about. So I had to spend my evening yesterday thinking about what I would say about these people that I had ignored, I must say, in the previous edition of my slides. Then also it would be interesting, I don't know how much time there will be for this, because maybe I put too many things into these slides, but again, if someone is interested, maybe the conversation could go towards some of these questions. It is also very interesting to talk about the current state of economics And the two interesting questions are the relationship between micro and macro economics and the question of the object of economics. There is a book which came out in 2019 by Alessandro Roncaglia. The book is The Age of Fragmentation. I think that Alessandro Roncaglia is the brother of a linguist, a scholar of languages or philology or something. And I think that he published a book with a similar title. So I think that the two brothers played with this idea because it was maybe important in both disciplines. But it is very interesting that the way Alessandro Roncaglia, who is the economist, addresses this problem, because for us it's a problem. You cannot recognize anymore which is the core of economic analysis. So fragmentation is even a very kind word to describe the current state of economics. And then this brings us also to the relationship between economics and other disciplines, which is something that maybe is very interesting for our discussion, because there is a relationship between economics and the study of ancient society, because there are various schools of economics that tried to address the problem. And I feel that there is something to say again on the method, on the general approach with respect to economics, because I don't know anything about ancient societies. So I'm here to learn from you. But I know something, at least I hope so, about economics, about the history and the state of this discipline, and also the questions and the problems that we try to address continuously, especially as critical economists. And then there are some questions that I would like. Okay. So only a minute to. Alessandro was just checking the messages, the chat, because we thought that there would be a problem. But if you cannot hear or see, please say that much. So the questions that I would like to address, but in this case, these are questions for Lorenzo and for the other people that know much more than me what we are talking about, are questions about what can we find in ancient economists that our tools can be useful to address. So I have an idea of what is a market and what is capitalism. The two things are not necessarily the same, are not the same actually, but I think I have some definition of this. But then we have to talk about the fact that ancient economies are or not market economies or capitalistic economies even, or we can talk about the degree of how much market was in this kind of formation. If we have other economic formations that can be studied with the tools of political economy, I will explain why the tools of economics are not so interesting, but still, I think that political economy cannot be considered as a universal science, a universal discipline. So I think that one should be very careful, aware of definitions, differences, and maybe there are things that we are not able to study. And maybe we have to learn from you what was the economic organization of ancient societies. I'm not saying that our tools are entirely useless, but maybe they have to be used with much caution. This is my general idea. I'm happy about this remark. Then, of course, I will deal with the notion of surplus, which is crucial in the classical political economy. And ask you, but Sergio Cesarato, who maybe is listening to us instead of paying attention to his students, wrote about this. So maybe, and during the other seminars of this series, there will be some specific seminars that address this question. But I would like to put some questions on the table, let's say, and then decide what we talk about. And also, of course, money, credit, capital, and competition. Competition is very important. And okay, so this is the plan. But of course, I'm not planning to say all of this. I just want to go on with the first part, and then we will decide, you will decide what we will talk about. But of course, Lorenzo will give us a lot of other inputs, and so not going down. Okay, okay. This I will not deal with this, but you know, it's something that I try to explain. It's very schematic. Economic thought is much more complicated than that can be in my speech. Also, I am a practitioner of history of economic thought, but not an historian myself. I don't know many things about economic history. I read something, but not on ancient economies, so, or societies. So please take everything with cum grano salis. So there are different theoretical approaches to the study of economic phenomena. That's what I already said. And I said that there is a difference even in the name itself of the discipline. I start with Piero Sraffa, both because he's a very important Italian economist, a very neglected one, because usually people do not speak much about Piero Sraffa. But Piero Sraffa is one of the very important intellectual figures, characters of the 20th century. By the way, he was the friend of Antonio Gramsci, the one who saved the prison notebooks, the one who helped. But this is not the main contribution he gave to thought, even if it's a very important contribution historically speaking. Piero Sraffa lived much of his life in Cambridge because there was fascism in Italy. Of course, he was of a Jewish family, and also he had published a couple of articles in which he explained the scandal of the Banca Romana. And so Mussolini was very angry at him, and it was better to be outside Italy, and he was appreciated very much by Keynes, who gave him a position in Cambridge. So Keynes is the one who helped him to make a life, an academic life in Cambridge. Piero Sraffa is the person who has rediscovered in the mid 20th century the approach of the classical economists. There was the need to discover it, to rediscover it, as if it was an archaeological discovery, because it was completely lost. In a way, as Piero Sraffa says in the premise of his book of 1960, which is Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, the title of the book, which is a very small book, but very dense, and in which he lays all the foundations of this different approach. This approach of the classical authors was entirely submerged and forgotten, because there was another approach that at the end of the 19th century started to gain dominance, up to the point of canceling altogether the other approach, because in the end it was the idea that economics, that's when the discipline started to call itself economics, had become finally a scientific discipline with a scientific method, and with truths, let's say, that could be regarded as universal, more or less. We will be more precise about this. And this marginalist approach managed the authors in the marginalist or neoclassical approach, which is based on demand and supply. If you ask anyone what is economics, they tell you two things: either that it is the discipline of demand and supply. I think that everyone knows these, the two curves that cross, or that it is the science of the way to reach infinite needs and wants, to satisfy infinite needs and wants with scarce resources. No, these are the two neoclassical definition of economics. But these are the specific to neoclassical economics. So in the classical surplus approach, we don't have anything of this kind. We have a completely different way of approaching economic phenomena. So we can say very briefly, no, it's better that we go not to the brief definition, but to a more precise one. Anyhow, the classical economists I am referring to are especially Adam Smith and David Ricardo and a lot of other people at their time, so at the beginning of the 19th century. Many contemporaries of Ricardo, not all of them. For example, Malthus was an opponent of classical political economy. I will explain why. And Marx is, in a way, a classical economist because he took the main methods of classical political economy. This is the phrase that he coined to describe these authors. So we call them classical political economists because Marx names them in the first volume of Capital. But he was critical of them for many things, but also it can be regarded as part of this tradition. And then there is the other tradition that started at the end of the 19th century. So it can be, so you may think that we are talking about economic thought or about something archaeological. I was very brave in using, maybe wrong in using that word. In a way, it was necessary to dig out this approach because it was not known anymore. But at the same time, the interest by Sraffa was not archaeological in the sense that it was just a history of the past. The approach of the classical economists proved, in his eyes, fruitful, proved useful to address the problems of the neoclassical approach that, in his view, was entirely insufficient to analyze what are the true characteristics of capitalistic economies, while the approach of the classical political economists was a lot more fruitful, a lot more liable to developments, to modern developments. So his idea was just to recover this approach and to up-to-date it for the understanding of the modern world. So I will also try to explain what was in the approach of classical economics, which was so appealing to Sraffa and to all the other people that followed him after his rediscovery. But it should not sound strange that now, in the 21st century, there are people like me, and especially my masters, that still propose to rediscover an approach which was dominant, at least, which was almost dominant a couple of centuries ago, or even more. It is not strange because being economics or economic theory a social discipline, we have a succession of different theoretical paradigms. We never have a linear development in this kind of discipline. If you think what happened to Keynesianism, that was born in the 30s as a specific part of economics, then it almost disappeared after the monetarist revolution of the 60s and 70s. It was almost forgotten. It was considered as a kind of blasphemy to be Keynesian. And then when the economic systems of the last couple of decades were hit by very strong crisis, Keynesianism was rediscovered, at least as a set of policy tools that could be very useful, if not entirely as a system of thought that could be reappraised and recovered. But this means that there is this alternate success of different paradigms that can come back. And this depends on the fact that sometimes theoretical frameworks are not abandoned because of their logical insufficiency or flaws or historical insufficiency in explaining the modern world, but because they have political implications. So sometimes the real question is that you have a lot of how do you say, giudizi di valore? Something that you understand very well. We will explain to our in our discipline, which means that sometimes some things are abandoned just because of this. Okay, this is the basis to explain why it could be, if it is convincing, still important to rediscover this. Okay, let's see first of all what the two approaches have in common before seeing the differences, because these are important also for the questions that we could address at the end. So I would say that one of the things that the two, I am talking about the theoretical foundations, the very theoretical foundation, not all the infinite varieties of neoclassical economies that have been invented since the start. First of all, we have the law of one price. This is very important because this means that even though it is true that in each moment we have so many different prices for the same commodity, and it depends on who is selling and buying it in which place, also at which time precisely, and so on. There is no point in having an economic theory, a discipline, if there is not a price to which one can refer in studying how the value of the commodities is set and determined. And the law of one price is strictly linked to the notion of competition. The competition that we need to state the law of one price is free competition. So we have the tendency to a unique price, not the fact that in each moment we have to have a single price. What is competition? Competition is the plurality of subjects that play the same role in a market. So competition is that if you don't like the price of the coffee that we just took, you go to another bar and you take the same coffee for less. Competition is just the possibility. It does not mean even that you have many people, but that there is the possibility that anyone can enter the trade. So it's freedom of entry and exit. The freedom of exit also is very important. The freedom of exit is linked to the fact that the costs that you undergo in order to enter a trade are not so big with respect to the volume of production and sales as to prevent you from exiting the market. It's like being entrapped. But anyway, this is a very general definition of competition. Free competition is both for classical and neoclassical economists, not perfect competition, which is a neoclassical, only a neoclassical notion. We will talk about that later. So this is very important. If there is no competitive market, or at least something that can be defined in as an approximation as a competitive market, it's very difficult to apply the tools of economics. This does not mean that we do not know that there are other market forms, that there are other arrangements, that there is monopoly, that there are big firms that make the market. But why it is so important to start from competition, then also to see at the other forms, studying them with some of the tools that we reach through competition, because competition is more than an asset, an arrangement of the market. It is exactly the impersonal force that determines the results of the market. So if it was not for competition, in a way, it is the same thing as saying that there is a market. For economists, at least, I am not sure that it's the same for you. And that's what I would like to learn from you, for example. Because if there is no this impersonal force, so why study economics or economic theory in general? Our discipline was born in the 17th, but especially initial part of the 18th century, in a system in which already the market was very important. And it was born because there was the need to study these economic arrangements that produced some results that had to be explained somehow. Because it's different when you know that for example, the feudal society had an economic organization, of course, but there is not much need to have a discipline to study it, because you know who is making the law, who has the force, who protects, who takes part of the product. It's not so important to have a discipline that study. The important thing is to have this impersonal force that can be studied somehow. I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that this is very important. For example, when we economists study the isolated exchange, it's something like a curiosum or an important thing to understand what is the force of competition, because in the isolated exchange, you have indeterminacy of price. You don't know what is price until you know who is stronger or smarter. So you have other things that decide what is the price, not economic forces per se. But again, I am open to discussion on this. So maybe we do not have many other things. Yes, competition and the law of one price are also strictly linked to the tendency to a uniform rate of profit across the various trades, the various sectors. And this is also very important because it's a typical feature of competitive capitalism. So now the differences. The main authors of the classical political economy I already mentioned. These are some of the references that can be useful to study. Grignani, Sraffa himself, of course, Baraduaj, and Sraffa, 1951, is the introduction to Ricardo's Principle, which is a monumental edition of Ricardo's Principle, and the one in which finally Ricardo was rediscovered as a different author, not an imperfect precursor of modern economics, let's say. So what are the characteristics of this approach? First of all, the centrality of the notion of surplus, which can be defined as that part of yearly production that the society is free to put to whatever use or even waste without jeopardizing the possibility of reproduction, because the idea is that production is a circular process in which you have to make some anticipation about the advance. The anticipation, among them, there are also the wages that you have to pay to the workers to put them in condition to work. So wages in classical political economy were a part of capital, but now we also to engage in dialogue with our fellow economists, we changed a bit this and also consider wages paid as post factum as a part of the income. So the centrality of the notion of surplus means that political economy deals with the way surplus is originated, the sides of surplus among different economies, how it is distributed, which is very important. For example, Ricardo only spoke about the distribution of surplus and not about how it grows in time, while Smith, for example, was much more systematic and offered a kind of economic history of general economic history. Another very important thing is that surplus is originated in production rather than exchange. This is very important because, of course, classical political economy was not the first elaboration of economic theory, was the first maybe systematic elaboration, but there were other theories. I will also try, if there is time, to mention some of them because they're interesting for some questions. But many economists before the classical economists, or at the same time, considered surplus and profit as something that was gained in exchange. There was the famous profit upon alienation, which means that you are simply able to sell something at a higher price at which you bought with respect to then you paid, to that you paid for it. It is very important for classical economists to find the origin of surplus in production. So production becomes central. And also prices in this kind of approach are indexes of the reproducibility of the single commodities and of the whole system. The idea is that prices are governed by cost of production, but not in a circular way. Let's say not by the cost of production as expenses of production, but by the difficulty of production. So prices have a technical origin in the conditions of reproduction of the commodities. And of course, these conditions are not only technical, but also social. For example, for classical economists, it was absolutely necessary to know the real wage that was paid to workers in order to be able to determine the price of commodities. Distribution, this is perhaps the most important difference. I don't know if it is the most important, but one very important difference between this approach and the subsequent neoclassical approach. Distribution is the effect of social forces, not of natural forces. Distribution is conflictual, and you have that the surplus can be divided according to a social rule between the classes that have somehow a pretense or a possibility of taking hold of it. So it's not that there is one specific rate of rent that you have to pay to the use of land that makes it possible to produce, as it will be for neoclassical analysis. It's not determined by economic forces in the sense of strictly economic forces, or as the following economists will say, natural forces. It's the idea, it's the social rule that determines distribution. For example, all the old classical economists regarded wages as put at a subsistence level, but this was again not an economic rule, but it was a social rule. So the workers were so weak in bargaining that they could not get more than subsistence. But of course, in the modern surplus approach, in the Sraffa variety and the other followers, we can consider wages as taking a part of the surplus. Because the problem is just the structure of the theory, not the specific hypothesis that the classical economists consider as relevant. So distribution is among the classes. And it is very important to know that for classical political economists, the society was divided in classes. Everyone had a place in society, which does not mean impossibility of social mobility, but it means that the economic organization is also a social organization. Then we see also very, very quickly, and I'm sorry, but luckily all these people are dead, so they will not be angry at me if I am so quick. What are the basic features of neoclassical economics? So we have this general reliance on the demand and supply principle, the demand and supply mechanism. It is important that the demand and supply mechanism determines everything in neoclassical economics, both prices and quantities, and not only prices of commodities, but prices of factors of services, of the factors of production, which means distribution. The wage is the price for the use of the service of labor, and it is determined in the market by demand and supply for labor. The same is true for the rate of interest, which is the price of the use of capital, the rent, which is the price for the use of land, and so on. So distribution becomes the problem of pricing of the factors of production, which is very different from what we have seen just now. How does this system of demand and supply work? You study the individual. You study the individual consumer, the individual producer, and they have a system of preferences, of conveniences and costs. Each of them maximizes either her utility or her profit, which is more or less the same thing. And so they make maximizing choices on the basis of exogenous preferences from one side and scarce means on the other side. The means are the resources that each person is in possession of at the moment he enters the system. So it is very interesting to see that in this kind of structure, of theoretical structure, the basis of economic behavior is not so much in social structures, in the institutions, in the way the society is organized, but in the human mind, which means that the discipline tries to become universal in a way. And this is what happens at the end of the 19th century. I think that you know much better than me that it was a period in which thought in general, and not only economics, was dominated by the idea that everything was measurable and in a way that knowledge could be systematized and measured scientifically, let's say. So each individual is free to choose not only how much it consumes or produces, but especially what is his or her place in society. You can choose on the basis of your endowments if it's better and more convenient to be an entrepreneur or to be a worker or anything else. So there is the undifferentiated individual that takes the main place in economic discourse, and especially classes are forgotten in a way. They're not more so relevant. I'm talking about the original formation of this, the original version of this theory, but it is important because even though now many of them talk about classes, they do that in a very special way. So it's better to see. It is also interesting that the notion of factors of production comes up with marginalism. It was not there before. So it's not division of the product now between classes, but the division of the product is between factors of production, the means or the people that contributed to production. Each is remunerated according to its contribution to production, which means there is now, this is very technical, so I refrained from explaining. It's the notion of marginal productivity of labor or capital or any factor of production. But at the same time, it's not only this that can be the basis of the explanation in terms of the distribution in terms of demand and supply, but we can also equivalently draw a decreasing demand for labor or capital or any other factor of production simply on the basis of its scarcity and on the fact that different proportions of the different factors are used in the production of different goods, and the different goods are substituted among them in consumption by the maximizing consumers. So each of the two structures or the sum of both, which are marginal utility and marginal productivity, produce the same result. But in any case, we have always that wage is the product of the comparison between demand and supply of labor. If there is abundance of labor with respect to what can be produced by labor, what is desired by consumers, then we have a low wage in that economy. If we have scarcity of labor, relative scarcity of labor, we have a high wage. With respect to the other factors of production, with respect to the things that can be produced with labor and capital. So we have that substitutability is very important, but this is, let's say, a more technical notion. Maybe I already spoke too much. I like speaking, and so I forget that I promised to keep the time. So shall I stop here maybe, and then we start again later? No, but I promised, oh, sorry. I wanted to respect my promise to make it more as a dialogue. So I wanted only use a part of it. Maybe I just say what is microeconomics. And then I leave the floor to Lorenzo. And then maybe I get other minutes later, okay? So I'm not going through all this comparison, but we can do it later because I am just repeating some things. But I would like to explain, no, the Nobel Prize. What is microeconomics? Because in these two different approaches, macroeconomics has not the same exact meaning. Usually we talk now about microeconomics as different from macroeconomics because it studies the behavior of the single unity of consumption or production. But you understand that this is typical of neoclassical economics. If we have methodological individualism, which even means not only that we prefer to study the individual, the neoclassical economy, but even that you cannot deduce the aggregate, the macroeconomic result, if not by aggregation of the single individual, who is endowed with preferences, with economic action, with choices, and it's the very unit of analysis. Then in the classical political economy, we cannot say that macroeconomics is this. But since also neoclassical economics use this analysis of the individual to arrive at the determination of relative prices of commodities and relative prices of productive factors, which means value and distribution. So we can say that a more ecumenic, let's say, definition of microeconomics is the theory of value and distribution. Again, a last thing, it's true that firms, entrepreneurs in classical political economy act individually because they also act one against the other. But this does not mean that individual action is the only basis of economic action. Okay, now I leave the floor to Lorenzo so that we have a bit more dialogue, and then